It is fall in the late 1800s. A brisk wind carries itself through decaying leaves into the dirty streets outside of London's East End. They come to rest in the district of Whitechapel, London. This small section of the unstoppable English city is upheld from within by an increasingly larger series of Jewish and Russian immigrants who seek to make a new life for themselves here. The scent of the earth that the city rests upon can be smelt through the brick below their feet. Whitechapel is scoffed at by passers-by its clay brick towers. It has brought only trouble to the city of London. The same firm breeze ushers some inside on an August night in 1888, but those who live outside the bounds of the law remain at large. This district knows only violence, crime, and squalor. It is here that the notorious murderer known as Jack the Ripper would take the stage, drawing eyes from all over London and all over the world. Jack the Ripper went by many pseudonyms in the press, like Leather Apron and the Whitechapel Butcher. But still, a lot has remained unclear about the maniac. Over the years, his name has been attributed to anywhere from a dozen to a few dozen to several hundred murders through London and England. And up until now, his identity has remained a complete and total mystery. What wasn't a mystery, however, was the inventive ways he would select and harm his victims, usually ladies of the night or illegal sex-working women of the East End. At least 3 of the murders at the time indicate a clear insight and anatomical knowledge of the inner workings of the human body, and a strong contempt for that of the opposite sex. In the preceding years, it became difficult to determine not only who Jack the Ripper was, but what he was responsible for, since the East End was particularly grim at the time, and mass violence against women was not uncommon. Further, journalists as well as attention seekers everywhere bloated this mystery by creating false narratives and writing fake letters to the press. Let's start at the beginning. According to the London Metropolitan Police Service at the time, Jack was responsible for 11 separate murders, all within 1 mile of each other, from April 3rd, 1888 to February 13th, 1891. There are widespread disputes about 6 of the 11 murders, leaving us with what experts call the Canonical Five. The first of Jack the Ripper's canonical 5 victims was a sex worker by the name of Mary Ann Nicole, age 43 at the time of death. She was last seen traveling across Whitechapel Road to a tavern on Brick Lane. Shortly after, the police report notes, she was turned away from 18 Thrall Street for lacking the money needed for a bed. Tragically, her roommate attempted to convince Mary to come to their nearby lodging house. Those on Thrall Street that night recall Nicole leaning against a wall outside of 18 Thrall Street. There, she was proudly proclaiming, "I've had my DOS money 3 times today and spent it. It won't be long before I'm back." Allegedly, she was proclaiming that she had made and spent the money for her bed several times over that evening, drinking her earnings away. Mary Ann Nicole would never be back. Not long after, her body was found lying in front of the gates on Durward Street, here, her skirt upturned. Jack's second victim would only come 1 week later. Annie Chapman, Jack's second victim, was another lady of the night, similarly turned away from lodging houses on Hanbury Street. She was without the money to stay in a bed that evening and was out to make more. Chapman approached a potential client in the dead of night. Across the way, one Miss Elizabeth Long looked on in skepticism before moving about her evening. Later, she would be questioned as a witness in Chapman's murder. She described the man Annie was speaking to. He was tall, over 40, dark hair, wearing a deerstalker's hat and a dark, dusty overcoat. Chapman's body was discovered at just before 6 a.m. on the morning of the 8th of September, 1888. She was found by a resident of the nearby lodging area. And so Whitechapel continued on, and the ladies of Whitechapel streets did as well. But as they did, so too did Jack. We know for historic fact that he would repeat this gruesome process 3 more times, each worse than the last. Elizabeth Stride was found stood up against a wall, toes turned inward, arms outstretched. Catherine Eddowes was found on her back, her torso opened, a shawl lay next to her. Mary Jane Kelly was found completely nude, shoulders flat against the axis of the left side of the bed that she perished on. For the next 131 years, his trail remains cold, and partially at fault is the media and the public. Over that time, many false links to other murders in the area are made, like the possibly self-inflicted wounds of one Whitechapel working woman, Martha Tabram. The general media and papers run wild with the story, alleging that the grandson of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, is in fact Jack the Ripper. Eventually, a most likely false letter is posted in Whitechapel, with half a kidney attached. It reads, "From hell, Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. Preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk." From here, the mystery goes international. No longer is Jack the Ripper a horror that took the lives and identities from 5 Whitechapel working girls. He is now an international celebrity. Wild theories connect Jack to murders across New York City, and just like that, he slips away, unnoticed, into the brisk fall London air. Until now. Now, we have DNA evidence to support a long-running theory that Jack the Ripper is none other than one Aaron Kosminski, a 23-year-old Polish barber, and one of the police's prime suspects in 1888. Who is this Aaron Kosminski? What could have warped him into the notorious killer that he was? Was he ever brought to justice? Well, Aaron was born to a tailor by trade in Kłodawa, Poland, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire. He briefly sought employ as an orderly at a Polish hospital. There, he spent his days as a type of hairdresser. Early in his adolescence, he heard the national news of the brutal assassination of Russian Tsar Alexander II, and soon after he immigrated in 1888 to the United Kingdom to be with his sisters in a safer land. Doing this separated him from both his father and mother, who would not be able to immigrate for at least another decade. As time passed, Kosminski found an affinity for being a barber, having done it during his time with the Polish hospital that he worked with. Unfortunately, he began to show up for work less and less as the tides of mental illness washed over him, slowly depreciating his will to continue in this new land. He relied on his sisters heavily and never had been able to right himself and settle into a new routine. He was a ghost walking the streets of London. It is about this time that Aaron turned to the women of the night as his own projects. At this time, several officers note in their journals about a Jew named Kosminski as their prime suspects for the Jack the Ripper killings. In 1910, Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson claimed in his memoirs that the Ripper was a low-class Polish Jew named Kosminski. This Kosminski was watched closely by the prying eyes of the police at his brother's house in Whitechapel one fall evening. According to Anderson, he was taken with his hands tied behind his back to a workhouse, and then, some years later, to the Colony Hatch Asylum, where he died shortly after. This, however, wasn't completely true. Kosminski's feet shuffled through the halls of Colony Hatch Asylum for nearly 28 years to come. So we know unequivocally that Aaron Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. You might be wondering how. It turns out, in the end, his own hubris led modern scientists right to him. Scholars were able to find DNA evidence on the shawl left at the scene of his second murder. The first genetic tests on shawl samples were conducted several years ago by Jari Louw-Helanen, a biochemist at Liverpool John Moores University in the United Kingdom. But he said he wanted to wait for the fuss to die down before he submitted the results. The unpublished results would trickle out to the public over the next few years, like in the 2014 book Naming Jack the Ripper. The general public was not satisfied with these conclusions. The private studies were put under much scrutiny and access to information regarding them was very tight. Though Kosminski's potential involvement was already known and his physical appearance matched that of witness testimony, the public wasn't convinced. Until 2019, when a forensics examination cross-examined the DNA samples on the shawl with Kosminski's only living relative, confirming at least 2 of the mitochondrial segments matched, enough for court sentencing were Aaron Kosminski still alive. In the end, that simple shawl, laid next to the Ripper's 4th victim, covered in his own bodily fluids, did him in. Perhaps in his haste violating and carving the victim, he got careless or frightened and fled the scene without thinking. But now we know, and you know, Aaron Kosminski will forever remain in the tides of history as the Polish immigrant barber turned killer. Aaron Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. This has been The Richest. Thank you for watching, and good night.